Right, now we are actually live, not like before. All right, so is this something that we want the other guys to be here, or is this something that I guess it's channels, it's all your thing anyway, right?
I don't think we need others. It's fine.
So this was so given IAsyncEnumerable, you're basically proposing to make the channel readers themselves effectively enumerable via this pattern, right?
Yeah, basically being able to use await for each to pull stuff out of the channel. So rather than having to manually write out the bottom pattern, you can basically just say await for each.
Right.
Now, the one open issue there's basically two ways we could do this. One is we make the channel reader itself implement IAsyncEnumerable, in which case you can just await for each it directly.
Right.
The other is we expose a method off of it that returns an IAsyncEnumerable, and then you await for each that. Right. One reason we might want to do the latter, and I don't have a strong opinion on this, so I'm open to other people's thoughts. Generally in .NET, when you for each over something, it's non-mutating. You know, you can for each it any number of times and you kind of get the same stuff out. Now that becomes less true when you start talking about async stuff, because it's async necessarily because there's some long delay, and that generally means that you're pulling the data from somewhere else, and so it's more likely that it's going to change. But that aside, this one is explicitly like every time you get the next element, you're actually effectively removing it from the reader. So it feels a little strange to me that we would say, if you just await for eaching this thing, it gives you the data, but it also mutates it. For that argument, we would want to expose some other method. Similarly, if you look at like blocking collection, it has you can enumerate it in two different ways. You can, if you just for each over blocking collection, you're basically just getting all the data that's currently inside it. But there's a method on it called getConsumingEnumerable, where if you call getConsumingEnumerable, you for each that, well, then it's actually taking stuff out of the blocking collection. And so I was wondering if we wanted to do something similar here and have like a getConsumingEnumerable method, or getConsumingAsyncEnumerable or something, rather than just directly, await for eaching the channel. But like I said, I don't have a strong opinion.
I would maybe just go with something that has read in the name, like reader.readItems or something, because reading in general is consuming, right? Like right. I understand that there's prior art in blocking collections, but it seems like a mouthful to say get AsyncEnumerable, or get consuming AsyncEnumerable or something. It seems.
So you would have like a read items async method that returns an IAsyncEnumerable.
Yeah, because to me, reading implies that you're advancing the state, right? If you read from a file, like you would expect, or from a stream, right, you expect that to advance the position as well.
So at the beginning of the proposal, you call the method getAsyncEnumerator.
That's the interface implementation.
Oh, this is already on the reader. Sorry. Yeah, I thought it's on the channel. I see.
The question is where we put the method, right? They could have, like, I guess putting it on a reader makes more sense than putting it on the channel. But
yeah, you need to have it on the reader. You could have it on both, and then the one on the channel would just delegate to the one on the reader. But in general, we haven't done that for any of the other methods.
Right. Yeah, I guess if the pattern is you have to say channel.reader.blah, then that's the way it is.
Yeah, and when we did this initially, we basically said, if it becomes a mouthful, if people care, we can add all the methods on the channel as well and just have it delegate. But I think generally the way things have emerged is people pass around the reader itself, and then, or the writer for the other side, and then they're just calling methods on the reader.
But we already have this property channel.reader, correct?
Yep.
Correct.
So if we implement it directly on reader, it will be basically for each channel.reader.
Correct.
That's weird.
Well, I think it feels actually the opposite. It feels nice, but it's a bit confusing that it's, you know, it's consuming.
Yeah, the biggest issue I have with this is if in the future we ever wanted the ability to enumerate the contents, like as they currently exist, and I don't know if we would, that would sort of naturally be what, you know, for each item and channel is. Yeah. Although in that case, it would probably be IEnumerable rather than IAsyncEnumerable.
So meaning if we had a preserving enumerator as well as a consuming enumerator?
Exactly.
Yeah, but I have to say I like the channel.reader approach much better than channel reader read async. It just seems like too much ceremony.
Would we ever consider an extension method on stream that reads async and just keeps giving you like span of byte over and over and over? Because if we would, I would assume the same name here.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by the, like, I think, like, if you look at stream, right, the default behavior is that it advances, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in collections, usually you don't expect to have any state, right? You just expect that you can do it over and over again, right? So that makes the blocking collections somewhat special in that if you use them for consumer producer scenarios, you think of them as queues. So the scenario is you want to get a consuming or a non-consuming, right? So they are almost at equal footing depending on how you use them, right? Versus here, I think this is closer to where streams are, where I think the default will be you want it to consume it. Right. Like, I think, like, if we ever want to do the other one, then I think I would agree with you that we will need to have a naming convention that is basically for types where you can provide a non-consuming behavior, but it seems very far-fetched. Like, Stephen,
it kind of makes sense to me. Like, if I were to say for each byte item in stream, there's something logical about, well, yeah, that's like, you know, pulling out the next thing from the stream and it's gone after that. But at the same time, if I were to say for each byte in memory stream, I kind of imagine that I was just enumerating without updating the position.
And that's why I was thinking, like, if we were to theoretically add an extension method or something on stream, which reads asynchronously and just keeps giving you back buffer, 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 buffer until the end while consuming the stream, presumably it would have read in the name to match what stream already has as existing instance methods, which, I mean, this is basically the exact same scenario. Why wouldn't we use the same name?
So I'm not sure how this would work. So you were saying you would, for each, let's say, memory stream, and then you would just enumerate the buffers without advancing the position?
No, it would advance the position. It's actually reading. Hence, the name would have read in the method.
So when
you can imagine this extension method existing off of stream, a helper method that consumes asynchronously and allows you to write await for each. If that method exists, or if we had, you know, a mental model for how that method could work, we could use the exact same name here.
I mean, I feel like we would probably just
it's a straw man.
Virtual on stream so that people could change the behavior of the extension method.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the shape of reader, like my straw man name, my straw man would be that we add a like read multiple async, and that is what returns the async enumerable. Because it feels weird to me that the reader all of a sudden is destructive enumerable. I can.
But reader is destructive. When you get a reader that read, you're gonna consume the item.
But the code actually has the word read somewhere in it.
Okay, that is.
My problem is that you while inspecting this object, the thing that looks like inspecting is destructive.
So Steve, on a related note, how do I pass? I understand how we would pass a cancellation token when we have actually a method. When we don't have a method, how do I pass cancellation token?
Into the get async enumerator on the enumerable.
It was, I think, in the first example above the screen.
Yeah, so basically this syntax, this kind of really nicely looking syntax where you just say channel.reader doesn't allow you to pass.
Well, you have to say channel.reader possibly read multiple async with cancellation and then pass the cancellation.
Right. So there's a with cancellation extension method off of IAsyncEnumerable. So in this case, it would be a wait for each t item in channel.reader.with cancellation token.
if we had a method, you kind of don't have to do it. It's just a parameter to the method.
Well,
No, you would still do it. It would
Oh,
it would
really?
be channel. It would be channel.reader dot whatever the method was would be returning an IAsyncEnumerable, and you would then call dot with cancellation off that.
Why would we not just have an overload of the method that takes cancellation token?
It's not a method; it's a property.
Well, if we had a method.
The semantics are complicated.
Even if a method that, like the pattern we're trying to, like with the decision to move the cancellation token to the enumerator, to get async enumerator. Now, if you start having a pattern where the things that create the enumerables also take a cancellation token, now there's a conflict between that token and the one that gets passed to the get async enumerator. So by having it passed to get async enumerator, we're basically saying the pattern is don't have a cancellation passed in anywhere else in addition.
Wow.
Just to clarify, Steve, getting the enumerator should be fully synchronous, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So it would be, sorry, did you say getting both the enumerable and the enumerator is both synchronous.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah.
The problem is the person who calls the IAsyncEnumerable into being may have different cancellation semantics than the person who's doing the enumeration. So the enumeration has to move into move next, which rewrote everything and made it ugly. Because the language team says they don't want to know about cancellation tokens and don't want to make it special.
No, I've been to all the meetings.
Right. I mean, like it would certainly be possible to add a method that took in the cancellation token and then called with cancellation on it and then bounded in the closure essentially for you, but I think it would create I think it would make the callers be even more confused. The ugly pattern at least has the consistency argument. And according to you, consistency is the most important thing in a framework. You wrote those words.
So back to naming. What was there was there a consensus from folks about what a name should be? Was it read something?
I suggested read multiple async.
Why multiple?
Because read async's already taken. And it gives the indication that it's doing more than one thing.
For whatever reason, that feels to me like it should be accepting an array or a span and kind of reading into that.
Yeah, I think read multiple implies that you read in batch.
Okay, drain async.
What about enumerate async? Like we have these enumerate methods in some APIs.
Generally, they don't mutate the underlying state, though. Generally.
That's why I like read.
Yeah, really the question is where do we have anywhere that has consuming enumerators?
I was suggesting items. Read async, read items async.
What's the return type of read async right now?
Value task.
It's a task of T or value task of T.
Yeah.
And it just gets you one item. Okay.
Yeah, read items async. I think the negative is the other one also reads items.
No, the other one reads item.
Yeah.
Well, okay, fine. It's not called read item.
Yeah, but read items kind of feels like it should accept a count and an offset, and you're specifying how many items you want to read. That's generally how we do that everywhere else.
What about read all async?
I think
kind of some people may think that it reads the whole array, and
Yeah, that's the implication.
Steve, what is the behavior of the enumerator? Does it only close when the channel gets closed?
Yeah.
So it would be read all unless you had multiple readers, in which case they're just stealing from each other.
Correct.
So read all async is reasonable.
Yeah, logically it basically returns an enumerator that represents all the items.
And we use read all x async elsewhere.
Yeah, generally when we use it elsewhere, it gives you a single contiguous buffer. But
sure. I mean, the only read all that I'm seeing is file read all lines async.
Yeah.
Well, read all bytes and read all text.
Okay. I searched for read all async in Emo's tool, and it's only returning 2 hits.
I just searched for read all, and I'm looking with everything that has async on the end.
Yeah.
on source.net.
Yeah, and generally it's going to be, it reads everything into a single buffer and just gives you the whole buffer in one shot. We can probably make an exception here, honestly.
Well, I mean, we need to sort of define the precedence.
Yeah. Well, if you go by what's already checked in, then the precedent is exactly as we just mentioned.
Right, so file stream, yeah, read all bytes, assuming those aren't iterators. Right? I don't know that we have any alls that are returning an iterator.
Well, in fact, on file, it's the opposite, right? The all ones are the non-iterator ones, and the ones that are the iterator are the ones without all in the name.
Is the debugger going to do anything with the iterator,
return the
like it does
collection,
with normal IAsyncEnumerable?
Well, they return usually a single string, or an array of
And is
lines.
that
That's actually a good question, but I imagine we can enlighten the debugger to recognize async enumerables and to not evaluate them.
Sorry, I missed it. What was the concern?
My question was, is the debugger planning on doing anything with IAsyncEnumerable like it does with IEnumerable?
Concern the debugger display will delete all your data and introduce Heisenbugs?
Potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, there are cases where the debugger, depending on what it's doing, doesn't actually create a copy, and you can mutate the original. So you could potentially be like, oh, there's an enumerator here, let me expand it, and then all of a sudden, none of your code works.
I think it could certainly happen, but I think that's unlikely, in particular because the debugger actually does a lot to ensure that it doesn't jump around threads or use synchronization. Anytime in the debugger you do something that would do that, it stops execution and puts up a little icon that says, like, this is going to do a whole bunch of multi-threading stuff.
Yeah.
Do you really want to do that? If so, you're going to have to slip threads and stuff. And IAsync enumerables are pretty much always going to be in that camp.
Okay.
So if the debugger were to do that, I would assume it would just, it would sort of always have that error in place. But I'm hypothesizing.
Yeah. Maybe just something we should follow up with separately.
Yeah.
What do we feel about read sequence? Well, it's kind of like the same with like enumerable sequence equals, right? Where you basically say like you have two sequences and you just compare them. I mean, that's the only other word that we have, I think, for
read enumeration.
You create async reader.
Read as enumerable, async.
Well, the problem is the reader itself is already async, so create async readers.
Yeah. Read as
enumerable works. It's just it is a little wordy.
And we probably want it to be read as async enumerable, right?
Well, read as enumerable. I guess
read as async.
Yes, it will be read as async enumerable because the operation itself is not asynchronous.
Then it should be get async enumerable because until you for each nothing gets read.
Well, we said read because the idea is that you make it clear that you consume. But normally we would probably call it get. All right, let's make a decision on the name so we can move on. I think we all agree that this is a scenario. Now it's just.
Well, I mean, like.
What did we hear? We heard read all.
Do we have any guidelines? Like I'm trying to skim the list right now that say that an enumerator/enumerable should not be destructive. If we do, then the guidelines call into question this feature.
Well, I think it's like async enumerators, enumerables were kind of designed for destructive scenarios because they are designed for kind of streaming scenarios, and they often are.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm just we're effectively inventing precedent right now.
So at least for regular enumerable, I would say that they have to be non-destructive from the perspective of it has to throw if the underlying instance is mutated at all. Async enumerable, though, is a bit different since it is async.
Yeah, I don't think there's that much precedence. I would be shocked if there's not a single person who wrote like an iterator that, read customers accepting a path and then does the parsing and returns the thing. And so once you pass over that enumerable and you consume it, you will read from that file. And like once it's drained, it's drained. Then you have to start over, right? Like I don't think that's unheard of.
Because we've also said enumerators don't have to be resettable.
Yeah.
Well, in
Like
fact,
that's already documented.
yeah, and even iterators in C# you can't reset either. Those always. So for most people, they will not have resettable ones.
Yeah, I mean, like I've definitely written destructive ones in application code. I just don't know if we've introduced any into detail.
Well, I guess I think the reason we haven't introduced them is not so much that we don't like them, it's just because that's usually a higher level, and we usually don't have that high of a level in the BCL. But I don't think there's fundamentally anything wrong with that.
And there's generally not a need to, because we just take a reference to the underlying array and then track an index.
Right.
And it works way nicer.
All right, so read all async. What was the other one? Read as, was it read as IAsyncEnumerable?
Or just read IAsyncEnumerable, I guess.
I think someone said enumerate async earlier.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I mean, again,
Honestly,
we have a weird. The method you're calling isn't async. It returns the thing itself as async.
They all sound fine to me.
Honestly, let's go with read all async. I mean, the only thing that's a bit weird is that async it's not an actually async operation, right?
No, but I think that's, at least at the language design meetings, we talked about, and I'll see if I can dig up a thread on it. We talked about whether we would expect these async enumerable returning methods to end in async, even though they were themselves not async. And I think the general consensus was yes, because you're going to see them 99.9% of the time written out in await for each. And so it kind of makes sense that async shows up there in the name.
And can you do?
Yeah, that's fair.
Can you do ConfigureAwait on the return? Can you do read all async ConfigureAwait false?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then,
yeah, I think
that
that's
with cancellation and yeah.
All right, so read all async it is.
The only place that I would have thought that maybe we had a destructive iterator is with Q, but it looks like Q has a passive iterator.
Yeah.
So it lets you inspect the state without consuming it.
Pretty sure all of the system collections do. Because they also, as Tanner said, keep track of if you make modifications to the collection so that they can fail. On some versions of the runtime.
Some of the collections.
Yeah. Because we introduced a breaking change between 4.0 and 4.5, where list of T's enumerator keeps track of whether it's changed and then fails.
All right.
All right. Hopefully this one is quick. We've already approved this API as an extension for IAsyncEnumerable. But then there's also IAsyncDisposable. And so if you want to be able to use configureAwait in an await using, you need to be able to tell the compiler basically how to await the ending dispose async. So this is basically, effectively another overload of configureAwait, but for IAsyncDisposable and instead of IAsyncEnumerable.
So actually, we just had a discussion about the cancellation token. Would it make sense to have one configure method where I can pass both this thing and the cancellation token?
So two things there. One, for disposing, we actually said that we don't want to make it cancelable because you're supposed to be doing cleanup of other operations, and if that cleanup is itself cancelable, you start getting into really weird semantics, like throwing from a finally block.
Yeah, I agree for this one.
For the other one, for enumerables, we talked about having a single method. The problem for me is with configureAwait in particular, we've talked in the past, and there's even an open issue about it, having an overload of configureAwait for task that takes a cancellation token. But the behavior there is that it ends up canceling the await operation, whereas this would end up stopping the enumeration. And there's an important semantic difference there. And so I'd be concerned that if this configureAwait took a cancellation token, but not this one, but the one on enumerable, took a cancellation token, that it would end up leading to a weird ambiguity or a weird semantic difference when you look at it and it was configureAwait on task versus on enumerable, which is how we landed on this separate with cancellation method.
And this one, how often people want to do something after awaiting this dispose?
You might have to dispose something in a very specific order.
It's for chaining disposal.
I'm just guessing.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question, Christoph. Could you elaborate?
How often people would do, await using IAsyncDisposable and then do something after the await completes? So more specifically, why isn't configureAwait false default on disposable? Is it just for consistency, or we think that often people will await and then do something and they want the thread synchronization?
I mean, I think it's very common to have code after using. If you just look across CoreFX or CoreCLR, there's a lot. There are many cases where something comes after the using. It's just part of a function rather than the whole function. And as far as the default, yeah, I think it would be it's consistency. It'd be, I think, really strange if some of your awaits by default in the same method, if some of your awaits did respect the current context and some of them didn't. I think that'd be really weird.
Yeah, I think if you think that people will be actually doing something after that, if it was just basically a wait and I don't care.
Yeah, if it always came, or if it 99.999% of the time was the last thing that happened in a method, yeah, I could buy that, but I don't think that's true. I don't think it's like the 1% case, but it's maybe even 50%.
So for your example, like I've written code before where I have an abstract higher level dispose method, and what it does, it has a socket underneath it, and what it does is it closes. It sends out like some closing frame on the socket, waits for the acknowledgement that was done, and then it disposes of the socket. So that means my higher level dispose method actually has two operations in it, one right after the other. So that's a scenario here. Makes sense.
And so this will be on task extensions, which is an existing type.
Yeah, it's where we put the other configureAwait with cancellation extensions, and it's an existing type, which means as written, if we ever wanted to oob them, it wouldn't. However, since the 99.999% use case is to use them as extensions, if we wanted an oob, we would just put them on a different type.
And so the IAsyncEnumerable and disposable, are they oob? Remind me, I forgot where it's blended.
Sorry, which ones are oob?
The async interfaces that we added, are they going to be?
They're not currently.
They are not.
Right. I think fundamentally this is one of those types where it would be doable probably, but it would be more than just the interfaces, right? To make them usable, you have to have the compiler infrastructure types that make the type actually awaitable and give you configureAwait and all of that. So it would be not super tiny, but also not super large.
Yeah, then looks good.
All right. Let me find my card
All
again.
right, thank you.
Steven, you broke up. Did you say something?
Oh, I said thank you.
Cool. Which now means I have to do work to get into the standard probably, right? All right.
Okay. So.
Oh, that's the one.
Right. So I had proposed extensions on span and memory called slice2, which took spans and memories and such. And this was the, if you have a lower level thing, then this will modify your thing if you have an overlap. It was pointed out during the review that this is exactly what the overlaps API, the overlaps API lets you write this yourself, but overlaps is only defined on span. And then there was a question of, well, should we define it on memory so you can do memory overlaps, memory or memory overlaps span without just writing that yourself, of dropping both of them to span, doing the overlaps work, calling back and calling slice yourself. But we didn't end the discussion with, yes, we should do it, or no, we shouldn't. And so then this popped back up again as, is this a thing that we want to do any work for 3.0? Or consider the scenario satisfied and close it until people complain. That's the background.
So it's the background, but do we now have more convenient APIs for the overlap? Or no?
So essentially I was suggesting these as I thought it was the only way of achieving it, but apparently it's just the more convenient way of achieving it. And then there was a discussion.
Like the methods that you're proposing as slice methods, not to detect overlap.
Right. So my proposal was, if you had a memory, you called an API that only took a span, they didn't have a memory overload. You now get back a read-only span, but you know it's contained within your memory, that you can get the memory that maps to the same range. And then it was pointed out that the overlaps overload that tells you what the offset is. So if you get true with an offset, then you could call slice yourself. And so then those slice methods became a convenience method, and then we sort of said no to them as a convenience method, and now there's a question of convenience overloads to overlaps.
Okay, so the slice convenience methods, it's not part of the proposal anymore. It's just those overlaps.
Unless, as these span architect, you think that they're worthwhile.
Well, the point is that either way, there's a new API. Right?
No.
We either add the overlaps
reason I'm
API,
asking is, I do feel
API.
like the overlap APIs are so convoluted. I mean, for good reasons, correct? They give you all the power, they give you lots of information, but they are super difficult to wrap your head around.
Right.
The slice methods, I looked at them and I'm not as sure that they add enough value. At least I think.
Yeah, I think the general argument last time was that these are basically, or the whole idea why we have the slice proposal in the first place is to have an escape hatch when the system screwed you over, right? So the idea is that hopefully these are rare scenarios anyway. If a lot of people would have to call the slice method all the time because we fucked up, then we probably should add the right types in those methods, right? So I think in that sense it's okay to say, yeah, if we messed up, you have a way of doing it in a type-safe way. It just requires you to write a few lines of code.
Because when we added read-only span of char.trim, we then added the one for read-only memory of char with the argument of, because if you had a memory, you can't figure out what the indexes should be, except you can with overlaps. And so technically we could have never added the redundant version for memory, and we could have forced people to use this API. Of course, then that's not user-friendly, so we would add the overloads anyway. And now the question is, if you fall into the pit of needing to use overlaps, should we make you drop all your memories to spans and call the existing versions, or should we also make overloads for memory overlaps memory and memory overlaps span? So that's really the question that's left now, is should we add these overloads, or say we're good enough as is, leave this alone until people complain? The question. I don't have a strong opinion once we're making someone use, like, if anyone ends up in this zone, they're already sad, as Chad pointed out. Slice 2 made sense to him. Overlaps is like, good God, this is.
And to be clear, the ones that we add there are also not strictly speaking required, right? You could do the exact same thing on.
Right, you can write this like the memory. The bottom line would just be you call .span on both of those and call the previous one.
Right.
Then that gives you back the index. You can call on the outer memory. You can call slice start index comma other .length. So you can do it with the existing things. It's just, can we do it more efficiently? Would be one reason to add them. That like we can do something better than dropping the span on both sides, or other
so can
usability reasons.
Not always. So if all we had were strings and arrays, we could be more efficient than dropping to span. But because we also allow you to pass in memory managers, we can't directly compare two memory managers for equality and know that they actually point to the same thing. For instance, you could have two different handles that reference the same physical memory. So in those cases, we would have to drop down to span anyway.
Right, but if the detecting that we're in the array or string case is better than dropping to span.
Yeah, that we can do very cheaply.
Then we could still make overlapped memory be cheaper.
Yeah.
Well, on the other hand, we may kind of point users in the wrong direction of just calling these methods and then using span pulled out from these memory thingies. So, basically, let's say they first check overlap, and they have memory. They check overlap, and then they do something with the span, and they pull out span again. So you pull out a span from memory, and they pull out a span from memory. That probably would be less efficient. So there may be a double-edged sword.
Keep in mind, we've also optimized the span property giver quite heavily, so this might not show up anymore.
Yeah, did you merge the
It's
merged?
So if we think that this is unnecessary fluff / possibly a performance trap, then we can just close this as no action needed.
Well, but having said that, I used overlap APIs in several places, and I kind of had to deal with these issues.
With memory or with span?
I now don't remember I just remember that it was super painful.
Okay.
Using overlaps or your scenario?
Yeah, basically I needed to do something with, knowing where I am, and these APIs were not super convenient.
Okay.
But
what would you like to have though?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I just observed the problem. I don't have a solution.
Yeah, I see.
Did you want slice to? Because if so, we can go back to the original proposal.
Yeah, I do see some value in slice too, honestly.
Really? Let's go back to the signature.
So before we go there, should we add these APIs regardless of whether do you want to caveat them on whether we add slice to or not?
The thing is, these APIs, you can just call .span and call the existing overlaps APIs. They could work just fine.
Yeah, if our answer is span is fast enough that the optimal implementation that we could add is not worth doing, I don't care about nanosecond optimization.
Yeah.
So.
We could add these if we see evidence that it's a problem, right?
I'm fine with that. So to me, the argument before was that we point people in the wrong direction seems much more compelling than...
Yeah.
And the other reason that I was suggesting the slice to is I thought VB had less support for talking through a span than it does. And since VB has as long as you stay in this tight little zone, and I think Steve pointed out last time we were doing this, that VB can solve this scenario for themselves. That it was not this unscrews other languages. So yeah, I'm completely fine with no. We just, since this was unresolved, brought up the question of do we have anything left to do on this?
Seems like the problem with the overlap APIs is that I wish it just told me, is it on the left, right, in the middle, or not overlapping. But we give people indices, and then I have to...
Well, if you just want yes...
Yeah, I know. If I just want yes, then it's simple. You never just want yes. Because usually you're implementing some algorithm that maybe will override.
Maybe. Like in the crypto APIs, when we're calling into OpenSSL, we have overlaps. Because if yes, they do not define the behavior, and we have to use a temporary buffer. If the answer is yes, we don't care which direction it was. So they explicitly say, if you give us overlapped memory, we will probably corrupt your process.
Great. So basically, you're being conservative. Yeah, I was trying to implement something that is actually optimistic.
Yeah,
And then you really need to know
the overlaps
where
left right tells you
and-
which way you need to do. If you need to do right to left copy or left to right.
Yeah, but we don't have that.
Well,
you have indices, and then you basically start like, okay, so let me now think which comparison with the length I need to do, and do I have one, off by one errors in my code, and
Yeah.
But you can determine left or right based on whether it returns a negative value.
which one?
The offset.
Yeah.
It just takes the offset from left to right, so you can get a negative value.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. But the problem is that then I have to like go to the whiteboard, draw the whole thing, and start thinking which indices are negative, which are positive.
That's really no different than like compare to, though, because compare to also returns negative and a positive based on whether it's less than, greater than, or equal.
Right, but compare to is not one of our proudest APIs, I think.
Well, and also, I think it's so much easier to think about compared to 3 different values that it can return.
Well, technically, it's not 3 different values.
Well,
but yeah,
you can. The only thing that you care is 3 sections.
Yeah, you care about the size. But yeah, I think the question is this a scenario that, because as you said, right? I mean, if you don't even remember what the actual coding struggles were you went through, like I feel like designing an API for that is hard without actually going in that scenario. And I mean, this question whether slicer would have helped you to begin with.
So the problem that I have with the slice method is that I think there are so many scenarios where, like the slice tool that you proposed is one of the scenarios where you would want to use overlap inside in the implementation, right?
Yeah.
I ran into so many different of these scenarios, and then we kind of singled out the slice tool.
Yeah, again, my original proposal
fix overlap such that it's so trivial that you basically can just write the code yourself.
Yeah, my original suggestion for the slice 2 was I thought that VB was that if we missed an overload on we're returning an interior segment of the data that you gave us, that VB would end up in a dead state, that they simply would never be able to use the thing. But we currently have a convention that will add all 4, or 2 if it's on char specifically, and so right now we don't really need this. I was just setting this up for us, but it is frustrating if you have a writable memory and you call an API that returns read-only span and you know it overlaps, and trying to figure out what memory do you need to pass to the second stage of your function. But that's fine.
There's something here. I think we are missing some APIs.
Okay.
I just don't know whether the ones that you propose are not just like one-off for this particular scenario, or we should holistically think like about this whole space.
It might be good to talk to Eric Earhart and see how they're using memory in .NET. Because I know they're using memory heavily, and they were having some problems with having to convert to span and back and yada yada.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I don't know who you're suggesting that action on. I thought that this was already dead, but
maybe we should not basically.
So.
Maybe we should like gather more gotchas in this space into actually this issue, and then at some point decide how we design it such that it solves all the problems.
You said you ran into quite a few problems. Can you aggregate a list of those?
I could try to search. I may have lost.
So how do we describe this general problem? Like, is it you want to deduce some information based on bounds of existing spans? Is that like I can try to wrap my head around like how do you even describe what the problem is you're trying to go after?
So maybe everybody has a slightly different perspective. I kind of run quite often into a case where span kind of is a black hole, correct? Like it loses lots of information. Mm-hmm. And often you call some operation, you get back a span. Now you lost information. And now it's very difficult to write code that, compares memory and span and this and that, knows where they are, copying, comparing, slicing one based on where the other is. So we added the overlap APIs exactly for these scenarios, but they are so low level and so difficult to use that every time I need to do something here, it takes me an hour of drawings on the whiteboard.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I think the primary case isn't like going from span to read-only span or anything like that. It's going from span back to memory, because you can't store a span. You have to store memory in most normal structures, and most APIs will want to work in terms of span because it's more convenient.
Yeah.
So you've got the APIs that have to be span, and you've got the storage which has to be memory, and how do you go between them?
Well, keep in mind that was the driving motivation for this anyway, because we were talking about we have read-only span of char.trim as an extension method, and we were adding read-only memory of char.trim as another extension method, and it was, oh, can you build an arbitrary read-only memory of t whatever extension method on top of an arbitrary span of t extension method? And the answer was yes, if you can kind of reason how to think about these APIs, right? So having slice 2 or something like that would solve the more general case of what we were trying to do when this proposal first came up. But yeah.
So if we think that right now there's not enough need, and that what we should do is figure out more, let's call it usability problems, span, in particular things that overlap solves the need for, then.
But maybe. So I don't have a very, as I said, I kind of observed some problems. I don't have a clear picture of what the solution is. And my initial reaction to this proposal was, wow, we are adding kind of a very specific method. Should we fix overlaps such that it's so trivial that I can just write this slice to myself? But maybe it's not doable. Maybe we want to add those slice methods. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion.
Writing slice 2 in terms of overlaps is trivial in that there is the one correct 5-line
once
implementation.
You know what the lines are, yes, it's trivial.
Yes, there is trivia.
Yeah.
You just need to know the right answer.
Right.
It's not necessarily easy.
Yes.
But it is. You just need to know the right answer.
Yes.
So this is what I would do we generally agree with that? Because then my proposal would be that we close this issue and then we revisit this when we have more evidence.
Yeah, what would really help here is just what code do we save people from writing?
Right. Well, I mean, the part of the original proposal for slice 2 is so that we didn't have to maintain the guidance that we have to always add the 4 overloads.
Yeah.
Memory read-only, span and read-only.
Right.
But if we're going to maintain the position that at least in the BCL and in FPG3, we're going to tell people if you take in a thing and return a thing, that you should return or have all 4 of them.
Yeah, I think we would have all 4 regardless, just because it makes it easier to use. But do we want other library authors to write all 4?
I think most library authors will want to write span and read-only span. So just talking on some Discord channels and stuff with people, a lot of them don't even want to add array overloads because they're saying, I'm on core, I don't have to worry about it. I'm just going to take a span because that will work for everything. And the only reason to add array overloads is for back compat. And so if people are already saying that about that, they're also going to say, oh, I don't want to have to write a span and a read-only span and a memory of T overload when span will be sufficient for everything. And the one remaining question is, how do I go back to memory of T?
Right. Well, because if it's just span in, if you're doing sum, right?
Right.
Sum over span is.
Yeah, if it's just an input parameter, then it's totally fine.
When it's both an input and an output, that now you end up with the quad version.
And if we have a single API that says, given a span, you can, or given a read-only span, you can go back to a span, or given a read-only span, you can go back to memory of T, then we solve the quad overload problem for any customer writing APIs, including possibly ourselves.
But if our guidance is you should add all 4, and the people who are only adding 1 are violating our unpublished guidance, then
Well, something like Slice 2 would help people.
Yeah, even if we say add all 4, you still have the case of I don't want to write the implementation 4 times. I want to write it once, and then the others are helpers that just call, as span and then to slice 2.
Yep.
So I think no matter what, we have a case of we need something that goes from span to memory.
Yep. So that sounds like we're suggesting going back on where we previously said no to slice 2.
Why did we say no to that? Do you remember?
Hey, Steve, why did you say no to it?
I don't know, Jeremy. Do you remember?
I just remember that you said that it was generally not needed and that it was accomplishable via overlaps, and therefore it was fluff. That's the summary in my brain. Not your exact words, of course.
Oh, that sounds like me. I honestly don't remember. I'd have to go back and look.
Maybe this is we should get a couple more examples of places where people will probably be doing this already, and then revisit and say this is what the API should look like.
Again, it's unclear whose action that's supposed to be. If it's mine, then I don't know when it will happen.
I can at least send an email to Earhart and see if he's got some more data on how ML.NET's doing this, because I know that they're having to do it already. So
yeah, I think in general, it's always best if the person who has the problem is collecting what the problem is at least, right? Because otherwise, it's a bit like fishing in the.
Right. So, when I originally proposed the slice 2, it was so that we, as the BCL, did not have to always add all 4. That we could add all 4 when we thought it was more convenient or prettier or something. But that this gave us an escape valve, and it let third parties have an escape valve, and then we sort of said we don't need it because overlaps, and our guidance right now is we always add all 4. And
yeah, I think that's.
And if we want to waffle on that position, then that's fine. I just don't have anything different than the original proposal.
All right. So any objections to me closing this issue?
It's fine.
Because then if we can revisit it,
if we get more data, we can reopen it.
Exactly. All right. So I think we are over time now. So unless this is super controversial or easy, seems easy enough. If I create from surrogate pair.
So the scenario here was that Asim had code that's going into the JSON stuff, where he wants to recreate the scalar value from a surrogate pair. Right now, there's an API char.get, what is it, char.from UTF-32 or to UTF-32, something like that. However, A, it's not a try API, and B, it doesn't really use the Rune type that we're trying to drive people toward. This is basically wrapping that logic in a convenient try-based pattern.
And when does it return false?
It returns false if you pass in something that's not a valid surrogate pair.
In particular, if high surrogate's not a high surrogate and
low surrogate's not a low surrogate.
So that can be checked. That could be done as a precondition check before you call a method that throws if you pass something.
But how do you know what those checks are?
Char.is
yeah.
high surrogate.
We can. Yes.
The same thing you're going to call inside your code.
Yeah, so you can already do this using existing public APIs. The thing is, this is a one-liner to do it. Whereas previously you would have to do 5 or 6 or 7 lines to set everything up.
So how does it how would I use this API from the point of view how do I not know my surrogate pairs? How do I come up with them out of thin air usually?
So they're not coming out of thin air. You're generally getting them because you're reading some data coming across the wire. In Asim's case, he sees /u encoded data coming inside the JSON payload, and the very first thing he does is he takes the first /u that he sees and he says, okay, let me try to treat this as a standalone scalar value. If that fails, read the second /u. If there's not one, just fail straight up. Once you decode the second /u, call this API passing both of them in. If this one still fails, the data's bad.
Then he throws. So
he doesn't have to throw, but he throws. He could do other actions instead.
I would say it's.
Is there an equivalent on Rune today that throws, or is there's nothing today that takes a high and a low surrogate and creates a Rune out of it?
Correct. We have APIs that we have try create APIs already that return false. The idea is those APIs return false. If you want an API that throws, call a constructor overload.
So there's a constructor overload that takes 2 chars?
There's not. I have, as the last line here, I say, hey, if we want a non-try pattern for this, we should add that constructor overload as well. There are constructor overloads that take a single char, constructor overloads that take a single int, and so on. There are also try APIs that take a single char, a single int, and so on.
So are surrogate pairs specific to UTF-16?
They are, yes.
So there's no UTF-32 equivalent, there's no
UTF-8 equivalent, there's no UTF-32 equivalent.
The UTF-16 specific problem of how do you represent data that doesn't fit in the 16.
And that's why these are typed as system.char.
So do we have examples of try methods in the framework that are basically just helpers on for something that a caller could check? Because we have lots of try APIs.
In 32.try parse?
No, that's not the same, because basically you would have to kind of parse the text yourself. So it's not a simple check, like, is it, is the text, if we had method, is the text with 32, then sure, you could do it before you could call parse, but we don't have it. This one is an example of something that, like, you could just check before calling this method.
So how long is implementation? Is it literally like a one-line implementation?
No, I mean, calling this is a one-line implementation.
No, I mean, like
if you blow up this check, like the implementation of this check is around 8 or 9 lines of code.
Really? Why?
Because you need to check the inputs, and then you need to reconstruct the value from the inputs.
Well, the implementation in char is...
Sorry, isn't it just char.is high surrogate, and char.is low surrogate, new Rune, convert to UTF-32?
It's a much more optimized implementation of that, but yes.
No, I understand, but functionally, that's what it's doing.
Functionally, that's what it does, yes.
Yeah, so going back to
you can totally do it yourself.
Yeah. The thing is, so current guidance for like when to introduce try methods is, if I just call the throwing exception method, it will be slow. The second thing is, it's not a precondition that I could just check.
So we already have APIs on Rune, try create APIs, like try create from char, try create from int. Like, why did we add those APIs if not as convenient as to create these things, where you want the framework to do the check for you so that you don't have to write that code?
So we have try create
absolutely
from char to Rune.
Yep.
And basically, if it's a surrogate, we return false.
Yep.
I would think like the common case here is you have a parser, and you get a character, and you want to say, if char is surrogate, then try create with current and next, and if that fails, throw. Otherwise, you're not in a surrogate pair, and you just process it.
So that API already exists too. Already exists today on System.Threading.
Okay.
There is an API that takes a read-only span of char and says just like read the first thing from this. And that handles both the surrogate and non-surrogate.
So if we already have a method try create that takes just one char, this one is just it's more of the same.
Yeah.
My comment was mainly we have guidance for try. We try to avoid adding try methods because we kind of are opening the gates a bit more and more. It's like, hey, keep adding try APIs for various things that normally would either throw or
try add.
It's really nothing more than a helper that wraps all of the checks that you would have done yourself.
Well, and we also already have the helper method char.is surrogate pair.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So
do we have that specific helper method?
Another thing we could do is...
Well, sorry, we shouldn't... We have is surrogate pair?
Yeah, we have is surrogate pair, which takes the low and high, returns true or false.
Oh, so it's a one-liner.
Yes.
Well, I mean, because that one... So, again, that one does get a little weird in that work then gets replicated when you call create. But these are stupid, simple checks, so...
Yeah.
Who cares about optimizing?
Like, this method could be implemented as return is surrogate pair, ? And then new Rune, otherwise throw expression.
Or default.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
I mean, that is highly not optimized, but yeah.
I mean, honestly, given that we have try create, I mean, like, I would suggest if you ship this method, I would probably just call it try create, not even bother with the from surrogate pair and the method name, because given your argument list you have, it's clear that you created from the pair.
I agree.
And then it basically becomes an overload of the existing 3, which, in my opinion, is
So
just...
then also added as a constructor, because that we already have that established pattern to it. All of the try create methods have equivalent constructors.
Personally, I would be okay with that. And that one would throw, right?
Yeah, constructors always validate.
Yeah. I'm fine with that too.
Yeah.
So let me just add this as a note. And we... Alright, so then let's do this, and then... Alright, I think that's it for today.
So you wrote the bullet point. This stuff is consider the try parse pattern for members that might throw exceptions in the commons.
And thanks to the people online.
It's not perfectly described.
Only the person who wrote that statement.
Mm-hmm.